My name is Michael Robinson. I'm the ESG Manager for Arafura Rare Earths. ESG, so basically responsible for all of our non-financial reporting, and as part of that also do all of our local and community engagement. I also do our approvals and reporting. The approvals, something that keeps every enviro coming back every day to work. So I just want to talk a bit about what we're doing here. Don't read that. So Arafura is going to be a miner and processor of rare earths, specifically neodymium and praseodymium, which is NdPr. So these materials are critical for technologies, but for a range of technologies, but most importantly for electric vehicles and magnets, for the super strong magnets that go into electric vehicles and wind turbines. So they make electric motors much more efficient. And for instance, a wind turbine has around 600 kilograms of these magnets in them per megawatt, and we're getting bigger and bigger wind turbines every day. So there's a lot of NdPr metal into these, particularly these turbines. So while we are part of the decarbonization supply chain, we are also ourselves a heavy emitter. So our project is an hour's north drive of Alice Springs. So it's pretty, well, I've lived in Headland and driven through Karatha, and it's a pretty good place to be, have a mine an hour away from a 30,000 person city that's not a mining city. So we're going to produce about 5% of global demand, so it's a really large mine. It's a long term of about 38 years currently, and that we haven't even drilled down on it. So that differentiates it from most mining projects, and it's also a big advantage for a lot of our sustainability and decarbonization goals, because we've got years and years to accomplish. So yeah, providing 5% of the world's NdPr oxide means that this is going to be about a $1.5 billion project. So by Australian standards, particularly from like a small size miner, that's a lot of money to raise. And we are just around there, and we're just around the corner from the remainder of our offtakes. So it's not just a typical mine though. Most mines can dig a big hole in 5 or 6 years. Ours is going to take about 20 years to dig, because it's really a processing plant. This plant is actually only about 10% of our costs is the mining. The plant is what we're there. It's a giant chemistry set in the desert. It'll have our significant processing site is about the size of the Darwin CBD. So the facility consists of beneficiation, extraction, separation of the NdPr to produce a highly refined and processed pure oxide product. With its size and life of mine, Arafura will be able to provide several hundred jobs and add to the local economies for decades. And that's what, to me, is one of the most interesting parts of my role. And for Central Australia, that's a big deal, and it'll be transformational to a lot of those communities. Like for instance, a lot of the Indigenous engagement work that I've been doing, there's several small, tiny, mostly Indigenous communities around within an hour of our mine site. There's about 500 people there, and that's folks that don't have regular work. So there's a lot that we can do and a lot we have in the pipeline in terms of training and getting people job hardened and job ready. And it will take years, but we're starting construction on Monday, so we're doing it now. So while our decarbonization pathway is our focus, it's important to recognize that it sits within a broader set of sustainability drivers, which are also critical to our success. That includes supply chain integrity, water consumption, our end-to-end waste management, and site and Indigenous and local engagement. Our sustainability journey isn't just driven by our ethics and investors, but also by our customers. We are already going to be operated in a well-regulated jurisdiction, but But good sustainability practices and ESG reporting goes beyond that. Our customers wanted to know more about our ESG credentials, our products' carbon intensities, and our waste and water management. They really wanted to understand where their products was coming from and what was going to differentiate Arafura from other potential suppliers. I should say one of our main strategies is to provide an end-to-end NdPr oxide solution through metallization and magnets to companies outside of China. All ESG strategy development starts by mapping out your material topics, which are the issues most relevant and important to our company and stakeholders. And of course, looming large amongst ESG material topics is climate change and carbon emissions, because we all know that mining is an intensive business, carbon-intensive business. So in last year's sustainability report, we made it public, our net zero 2050 commitment. So Max is here to discuss the work Arafura has been doing to help us meet that. And that's all I have for now.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Cheers. Alan was kind enough to mention a bit of the history of the founding of the Net Zero Network. And what he didn't say, or was kind enough not to say, is it was really a response to an early midlife crisis by me, where I started to wonder what it was that was important to me and what did I want to have impact on. And there are a lot of things which happen in an early midlife crisis you probably don't want to tell people about, but this is something which I do want to talk about, and I'm fortunate to be able to talk about it because on the 31st of January this year, Arafura released the GHG Emissions Reduction Pathway, which was a response to many of the drivers that Michael has been talking about and which I've been working on for the last 6 or 7 months or so. So it's not often that you get the opportunity, at least in the industry that I work in, to talk so publicly about work that you've done. And I just really wanted to take the opportunity to share what we've done, how we've been on this journey to understand Arafura's emissions, and how we've put in place a plan to tackle those, or the beginnings of a plan to tackle those. So I hope you find it interesting to learn a bit about the story and a little bit about the journey. And please do feel free to jump in if you've got any questions, or we can tackle questions in a Q&A at the end as well. Oh, you missed a whole slide, Michael. You covered all that though. Yeah. The important point is that ESG is really, really important to Arafura. If you look at the end product which is being produced, electric vehicles, wind turbines, those are products where the manufacturer really cares about what their customers think about the credentials of the material which goes into them. And so for that reason, all these things are particularly important, and climate change is first and foremost amongst those. So, as Michael mentioned, we started to look about 6 months ago at this question of what the emissions of the plant were. And that was about the point that I joined Arafura working alongside them in a role as part of a broader KBR team. So I work for KBR and there's a big team which is embedded within Arafura. The reason that I joined was because the customers were starting to ask questions about what are the emissions going to be, how are you going to reduce them? I came in to provide some strategic oversight into that question. And what I found when I started to dig into this facility which was proposed, the Nolans Project, is that just as Michael said, this wasn't really a mine at all. So this is really you called it a giant chemistry set in the middle of the desert. From an energy systems perspective, it is a processing facility. 90% of the energy, and thus the emissions basically, is from that processing, not from the driving the mining trucks around and material movements and so on. So I wanted to give you a sense of what the kind of energy involved looks like. What's the visceral feel for it? And I may no longer work as a naval architect, which was my previous career, but I still think in terms of ships. This is a video that I took off the back of a high-speed ferry designed and built by Austal, who I used to work for. And this ship is powered by 4 high-speed diesel engines, each around 10 megawatts each, so it's 40 megawatts in total. It weighs 1,000 tons and it goes at about 80 kilometers per hour. And for reference, that's a 40 megawatt ship. The Titanic, I looked up today because my son was reading a book on the Titanic, had 34 megawatts of installed power, so more power than was installed in the Titanic. So that amount of power is about the electrical power requirement of the processing facility. It's actually, I think it averages out at about 44 megawatts. And if we're talking in terms of superlatives to describe the size of something, then no talk will be complete without mentioning an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So this is BT Park, which is just up the road from me. And I show this because, as well as the electrical energy requirement, Arafura also, with the Nolans Project, has a significant steam generation requirement, which is actually much larger. So it's about 140 megawatt requirements, about 3 times as large as the electrical requirement. And it's the equivalent to boiling off an Olympic-sized swimming pool every few hours. So it's an enormous amount of energy which you have to put in. All of that would be a significant, or it still is a significant challenge if you're thinking about how to get that energy renewably, but it's a lot less of a challenge than it was 10 or 15 years ago because of what's happened to the cost of renewable technology. So many of you might be familiar with these trend lines already. What they're showing is that the cost of solar PV for the generation of electricity and wind power in particular has really plunged to the point where a megawatt hour of energy is actually cheaper now to generate from renewable sources in some situations than it is to get from a fossil fuel. So that gives us great cause for hope that even in these challenging situations where we need an awful lot of energy, that you can actually get that from renewable sources. And if the Arafura problem around the Nolans Project was just about the electrical power, this then would actually be a relatively simple story because you could take lots of batteries, lots of wind turbines, lots of solar PV, and you could create a microgrid to provide the power that you need. And with enough of those things, particularly batteries, you could hit the availability and reliability which is required of a factory which has to operate 24/7 and at 85% reliability. But the Nolans Project isn't quite that simple because it has the steam requirement as well. So one thing that you can think about doing is, well, can we generate all of this renewable electricity and then can we turn that into steam? And there are a couple of different ways in which you can go about doing that. So the first way is, this is actually a picture of the kettle from my house. We've all got this capability. You can heat water with a resistance element, very simple, and you can boil it off. And that process is actually remarkably efficient. It's about 95% efficient in terms of the conversion of the electrical energy into the thermal energy. That's one option. And if you're doing that on a big scale, that's an electric boiler. The other emergent option is the use of a heat pump, which you might have heard about. So a heat pump is basically the reverse of the air conditioner, which you have in your house. And the miracle of a heat pump is that you're actually concentrating heat in one place. So you're not actually turning one form of energy into another. You're just using one form of energy, electrical energy, to concentrate heat in one place. And what that means is you can actually put in a certain amount of energy and get more useful energy back. So you can have what's called a coefficient of performance of a heat pump, which is well above 1. It can be 2, 3, 4. So that sounds fantastic. It feels like you're getting energy for free. The catch is the coefficient of performance that you can achieve drops off depending on the temperature range which you're trying to cover. And if you're looking at creating 160 or 180 degree steam, which is the requirement here, that's right at the upper limit of what is potentially possible with industrial scale heat pumps. So the jury is still out on whether or not you can actually use a heat pump which will do a better job than an electric boiler. It's an emerging field, and I would love to speak to anyone who has more information on that. You could also, rather than going from renewable electricity and generating steam, you could think about how you can just generate that thermal source in a renewable way directly. So you could play the favorite game of a juvenile delinquent, and you could take a magnifying glass and you could shine that on something and make it hot, and there you've got a heat source. And if you thought about doing that at enormous scale, well, then you basically would have invented concentrated solar thermal. So in a concentrated solar thermal plant, you do that the other way around. You have a whole bunch of different mirrors, and they're all concentrating the energy of the sun in one place. And then in this example, in a tower concentrated solar system, you have a working fluid, often it's molten salt, which is pumped up to the top of the tower. It gets really hot from all the sun shining on this one place, and then you can take it away to do useful things like heat exchange with water to generate the steam that you require. Concentrated solar thermal isn't just a theory, it is out there. This is a 50 megawatt electrical plant in China, and China has a dozen or so of these plants and more which are under construction at the moment. So this is a technology which already exists at scale. It can be configured in a couple of different forms as well. So the tower version is what I've just showed you. You can also have these what are called parabolic troughs, where you've got these mirrors which are shining onto a central tube which is full of a working fluid, normally hot oil, which again heat exchanges with the fluid which you're interested in heating at the end of its loop. So there's different ways in which you can apply that principle. What happened over the last 10 or 15 years for the generation of electricity from that method is it was outcompeted by the solar PV and the wind and the battery combination. That was just a cheaper way to generate a megawatt hour of electricity, rather than taking concentrated solar thermal energy, using that to generate steam and then using that to generate electricity. But that's not the end of the story for concentrated solar thermal, which is why we're going to come back to it later on. Another variation of concentrated solar thermal is, rather than having molten salt, which you make hot, or oil, which you make hot, there's now the development of technologies which are based on particles. So like large grains of sand, which are lifted in mechanical lifts to the top of the tower. And then just like the guy is letting them fall out of his hand, you have this waterfall of these beads which pass the solar receiver and they get hot. And the advantage of that is that potentially you can actually go to much higher temperatures, working temperatures, than you do with a molten salt solution, which means that there's more that you could potentially do with the energy, particularly in industrial processes. So that's electricity. Oh, sorry. Now let's look at the other way. So, okay, if you get yourself some hot steam and then you want to turn that back into electricity, which I've already talked a little bit about, you can do that using a very conventional method, so a steam turbine. And a steam turbine is at the core of a coal-fired power station, for instance, where they heat water in a boiler to create steam, and then the expansion of the steam and the cooling of the steam transfers that energy into rotational energy, which then turns the generator and generates electricity, which is great, but you lose a lot of energy in that process. So a steam turbine is typically around 40 to 45% efficient, so you're essentially throwing away 55 to 60% of your energy, which may be necessary if you want electricity out the other side. So we talked about electricity generation, we talked about thermal generation. The next obvious energy step is to think about storage. Electrical storage has a few different means, I suppose. The first and most obvious is batteries. We're all now quite familiar with large-scale batteries. Electric vehicles are familiar on our roads. And utility-scale batteries, which essentially just take a whole bunch of different lithium-ion batteries which already exist in vehicles and put them together into modules, exist as well. There's the Hornsdale Reserve, which has been operating in South Australia for some years now, for example. There's a new 100 megawatt battery which is going in Kwinana under Synergy. So batteries are a well-known technology at scale. There are other ways in which you can store electrical energy. So you can take electrical energy and you can convert it into gravitational potential energy. So you can have pumped hydro. The problem with the Nolans Project, I haven't been there, Michael has. Are there any hills like this? No. So that's a challenge. The way that pumped hydro works is you're running a pump with electricity to pump the water up the hill, and then when you run it down, you get that energy out again through a turbine. So it's pretty simple, but the round-trip efficiency is actually pretty good. It's around 70% from memory. A few months ago, I did some back-of-the-envelope sums to try and understand what kind of volume of water do you need to store energy as pumped hydro. And this is the amount of water I believe I would have to pump up a 15-meter water tower in order to store the same amount of energy which is in the 15 kilowatt hour battery I've got installed in my house. And that battery is about this big and sits in my garage. So it shows you that pumped hydro is a very challenging proposition to make practical unless nature helps you out by putting a hill on your doorstep. And unfortunately, the Nolans Project doesn't have one of those. But you can think about building your own way to deal with gravitational potential energy. So this company, Energy Vault, this is one of their prototypes. I think this picture was taken by someone from a train. That's why it's got the lines across it. They lift up concrete bricks up into the air, exactly the same concept as pumped hydro. And then when the brick is released, the resistance in the drum is transferred to a generator, which generates electrical power. So similar round-trip efficiencies to pumped hydro. I'm not a massive fan of Energy Vault technology because of the mechanical complexities involved in that process. It doesn't strike me as a completely practical proposition. Happy to be proven wrong. Thermal energy storage. I've already talked about molten salt, and we've talked about that as a transfer fluid within a concentrated solar system. So it's a way of moving your energy which you gather to somewhere else and turning it into something else. It's also a fantastic storage mechanism. So if you take that molten salt and you hold it in drums, those will stay hot for a very long time, and then you can pull that hot liquid out when you need it. There are other ways of doing that as well. This system here is from a company called Rondo, and their system is based on heating up bricks. So they essentially sell what is basically a big brick toaster where you have electrical resistance heating of these bricks, which get really, really hot and then will stay hot in this insulated box for a long time. So the advantage of that compared to a battery system is that the per unit energy storage is actually much, much cheaper than batteries. The disadvantage is if you want to take that substance which you've made hot and then use that heat to generate electricity again, well, then you're down to losing that 60% of electricity, energy, which I talked about before. But if your end use is actually thermal energy, well, then this can be a really good way to store energy. So I'm quite biased towards this. I liked this whole concept of hot bricks. So I've just taken you through a bit of a rundown of some of the toys in the toy box, which you would apply if you were thinking about decarbonising operations like the Nolans Project, where you've got a thermal load, and electrical load. And there were other things which you could throw into the mix as well. You could bring in nuclear reactors, those sorts of things. We had a couple of wild cards which we showed in the release which we put out. Geothermal anywhere was one of them, if anyone thought about that. The idea of drilling holes deep down into the Earth's crust, way deeper than holes have ever been drilled before, and then harnessing the heat down there. If that works for the Nolans Project and works in other places around the world, we won't have to have this group anymore. It would be an incredible outcome, but it's still some way off. Shake to the head. There you go. So we realised that if you take all of these different options and other ones besides, you've got so many different permutations that finding the optimal solution will take you forever and a day with the world's largest supercomputer. And we didn't have that, and we didn't feel like we could achieve that. So that's not what we did. Instead, the first filter we applied was one of expert judgment. And that got us to the table that you see here, basically. So we consolidated some things to simplify our modelling, things like electrical energy storage. I didn't think about the different kinds of electrical energy storage, whether or not you're going for a lithium-ion battery or vanadium redox flow battery. We'll just call that electrical energy storage. And then we discounted some options as well. And that gave us our shortlist of technologies. And then rather than trying to combine everything with everything and every possible combination, we decided to take a scenario-based approach. So we would take particular mixes of all of this stuff to create emissions reduction outcomes over time on the Nolans Project's journey to net zero in 2050. It's worth saying a word at this point on firming power and just describing what we mean by that. So imagine, we'll talk about this in the electrical context, but the same principle applies to the thermal energy as well. So imagine you've got this processing plant which runs at a constant load of roughly 44 megawatts. And that all runs on gas-fired generation. So you've got gas reciprocating engines, say, which are generating the electricity. And then, good news, you introduce all these renewables. So you've now got wind and solar, which means at certain times of the day, you're getting all of that 44 megawatts completely from your renewable sources. But at other times of the day, when the sun isn't shining, the wind isn't blowing, you still need to fill the gaps in order to maintain that 44 megawatts. And what you actually find is even when you start increasing the amount of renewables you have to very high proportions, it's very, very difficult to get rid of that final bit because it's just a statistical truth that there will be sometimes when the wind doesn't blow, the sun doesn't shine, and you run out of battery capacity. So that's why we need some sort of firming power, something to step in to maintain the electricity supply to meet that load. But we want to get to net zero. So the way that we decided to model that was to look at introducing a progressive blend of a renewable fuel. And that could be one of the different options shown there. So it could be a biofuel made from a sustainable source of biological input to that fuel, or it could be a synthesized fuel where you're taking green hydrogen produced from electrolysis and you're combining that chemically with captured carbon dioxide to produce a fuel which synthesizes diesel, for example. What we did is we decided, rather than looking at all of those different options separately, we would combine that into one generic renewable fuel type, and we would have a cost associated with that and a cost projection associated with that. Come back to costs in a minute. So the process that we went through once we had decided that we wanted to model these different scenarios was firstly to set what our target emissions reduction profile would be. So we know we've got to get to net zero by 2050. What does that look like? What are the steps at 2030 and 2040? And we chose a linear reduction profile. And then for each of these pathways, we needed to design the pathway capacities. And I'll go into what each pathway looks like in more detail in a second. But for example, you need to decide on a certain year in this pathway between now and 2050, how much solar you're going to have, how much wind you're going to have, how much battery, how much concentrated solar thermal. And that's a bit of an iterative process because you need to understand what the impact on emissions of introducing those things will be, and then you tweak it and hone it until you achieve the emissions profile which you're after. And then there's a question which we haven't touched on, but which is the most important driver of the whole thing, which is how much is all of this going to cost? And this is actually where the majority of the work was. So once we've established that we've got a pathway where we're going to reduce emissions in a certain way, how do we put a cost on that? And how can we do that in a way which enables us to compare one pathway to another? So what we did is we relied on publicly available information. There's actually fantastic information on the current and projected future costs of renewable generation technologies, things like the CSRO Gen Cost report, as well as relying on our own research into things like renewable fuel prices too. So all of that enabled us to construct a cost profile over time. And I'll show you how that was presented in the results in a minute. So we did.
Did you get the gas costs?
Where do we get the gas costs? The gas costs projection, that came from the Gen Cost, from CSRO Gen Cost, yeah. Yeah, so there was a projection of costs over time. And there was, for most of the work, we did it based on the most likely cost. At the end of the report, no one makes it to the end of this report, which has been released. But if you go onto the Arafura website and you actually get to the end, there is a series of ranges, and those ranges were done through a Monte Carlo analysis, assuming high and low on gas price. And then that enables to compare the pathways and select a winner. But it's not quite as simple as selecting the cheapest, because you've got things to think about, like what your cash flow is, which is going to be important to the project. The project will need more cash in the early years and find it more difficult to get hold of cash than when it's an established producer. There's also questions of risk, technology risk, risk of having a negative impact on the production of the site as well. So you've got to take all these different considerations into account, and that's where it gets a bit more qualitative. So what were the different pathways we considered? Well, the idea of the construction of the pathways was they would be representative of the solution space, so they would be as different as possible from each other. The first pathway was called separate electrical and thermal generation. And each of these is a simplified version of what this would look like, because in reality, it wouldn't be quite as clean as having these two things separately, but we modeled them completely separately so that we could explore the pathways. So you've got wind and solar, and then you've got your thermal generation, the concentrated solar thermal, which we talked about. Electrical storage, you've got batteries. Thermal storage would use the working fluid from the concentrated solar plant, so we've assumed a molten salt for the costs. And then electricity, that's pretty simple. You just take it out of the battery again as electricity. And the thermal storage is used through a heat exchanger to generate the steam, which you require. So that's the first pathway. Quite a simple application of the technologies which I've already described. Now we can start to get a bit more funky. So the second pathway was the one which is on everyone's lips at the moment, which is electrify everything. So let's go to that situation where we generate all of our power from renewables. And then we take a proportion of that and we turn it into steam. And we decided that we could take a punt on that being done with heat pumps, but at a reduced performance of about 1.5, which still means you're getting 50% more useful energy out than the energy which you put in. That was the second pathway. Now the third pathway is reversing it and going the other way and saying, okay, well, the vast majority of my power is going to come from the concentrated solar plant, and where I need thermal energy, we will then use a steam turbine, as I showed before, to turn a proportion of that energy into the electrical energy which we need. The fourth pathway is a little bit different. So on the electrical side, it's like the first one, where we're just using wind, solar, and battery. On the thermal side, we've said we'll stick with generating the thermal power from gas-fired boilers, but we will use the renewable fuel which we're introducing to completely replace the non-renewable fuel, the natural gas, at a proportion which enables us to hit our emissions goals. So that's using a lot of renewable fuel much earlier than the firming requirement for the other pathways. And finally, number 5, the one that I really like, is the hot bricks one. So this is the one where you're taking your electricity, your wind and solar, and then you're using a proportion of that to heat up these bricks, and then you store energy there for when you need it to use later. The reason that I really liked this one is because when you've got a concentrated solar thermal plant and that is heating your energy storage, that's only working during the day. Whereas the concept of having electrical heating, which can potentially be running at night as well if you've got a good wind resource, has the potential to have a more overall efficient outcome, more economically efficient outcome, because you're operating your capital more at the time. Didn't turn out that way, but I was excited by that one. So this is what the emissions profiles look like, and I've intentionally not put a legend on the graph because I don't want to tell you what the colours of the different pathways represent yet. But the key thing to show you here is that this is a linear reduction to 0. So the black line is our target line. And then each pathway is stepped in pretty much the same way to get there. So that's where we iterated on the capacities of the different technologies which we're introducing at different times. The analysis was simplified into 5-year blocks, which is the reason that you've got the steps. And emissions is basically what we held constant. So the end outcome in terms of emissions for each of the pathways was the same, plus or minus 1%. So the more important bit is the results. And the financial results are presented here in terms of a metric which we came up with, which was equivalent gas price, which confuses almost everyone. So I'll try and explain it. First, we decided to use it now, and then what it actually was. We didn't think it was appropriate at this stage to put out absolute values of the cost associated with each pathway, because we felt it was too early to do that, and people might take a view on what the impact of that was on the project's economics. But we did feel it was important to include the economics in the comparison of the pathways, and we wanted to publicly explain what we were doing through all of this, which left us with a bit of conundrum about how we do both those things at the same time. And what we came up with was this concept of equivalent gas price. So the equivalent gas price is the price of the gas in any one year, which would make that pathway cost neutral. So a really expensive pathway, you might need the gas to get to $25 a gigajoule. A really cheap pathway might be only $5 a gigajoule. And as you introduce new technologies, the cost of your pathway changes because you're taking on more financing costs and so on, or more fuel costs in the case of the renewable fuel. And that's why the lines step up and down. Told you it was really confusing. If anyone's got any questions on that, you can ask. The black line there is $8.34 a gigajoule, which is the current assumption in the project's published most recent update on what the gas price that they're going to have access to over the life of the project, which is a number you may or may not agree with, but it's what the project has assumed at the moment. So basically, if overall we're below the line, we're winning, and if we're above the line, then we're more expensive than the gas. Does anyone want to take a stab out of those 5 pathways, which was the most expensive? No?
I'm going to take a stab and say the hydrogen one.
Yes, the imported renewable fuel, which intuitively makes sense, because if you're having to use renewable resources somewhere else to go through a process like electrolysis, which throws away some of the energy in the process, and then you need to import that and have all the transport costs associated with that, or combine it into another fuel which is then imported, that all stacks up to a pretty expensive solution if you've got other options available to you, and sometimes sites don't. But in this instance, we have other options available to us.
When you say imported, do you mean imported from outside your site?
That's correct, yes,
Not
yeah.
from
No, that's right. Yeah, so we just made an assumption on the gate price that you're paying for your renewable fuel. And it was a pretty cool model because we decided to all lump it together as one example cost. Second one, full electrification. This is disappointing if you're a proponent of electrify everything, but again, intuitively, it feels like it makes sense. When you've got a site which has got that large a thermal load.
Just out of interest, with the imported renewable fuel scenario, how much of the cost of the renewable fuel was the transport, and how much was the creation of it?
Yeah, so we made some, all we did is we took forward projections of the price of hydrogen in Australia, and then we made some assumptions on the uplift associated with that for either transporting it if it was still hydrogen, or the conversion into a fuel, and then assume the transport was lower cost. So we decided those two things would sort of cancel each other out a little bit, and then we got to one number. So it wasn't a very detailed way to look at it.
Did you look at biomass-based fuels, so like biodiesel or something like that?
Only at the level where we identified it as a potential solution, and put it at the same price point as those synthetically derived fuels. It's an interesting point because I saw a release, I think it was just today, about BHP using a biomix.
So I would expect that biomass derived fuels would be substantially cheaper than like e-fuels from hydrogen or.
You could imagine how their production costs would be cheaper if you're in a future scenario where it's a like-for-like product. You would expect the market to ultimately set their prices to be similar to each other. I'm not an expert on biofuels at all. It comes down to the availability of supply, I suppose.
Yeah, it would basically be governed by how much people are prepared to pay for jet fuel.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Which is, you're right, that will likely dominate the market, yeah. I think about that quite a lot in my previous life, working on the design of ships. Full electrification, so yes, if you're taking all that energy and you're using it to generate thermal energy from the electrical renewables, that's an enormous wind and solar farm you have to build, an enormous battery to keep that steam provisioned 24/7.
Max, does this include OPEX as well? Or is it
Yes, yeah. So the model included.
Something like full electric system that's simpler and there's a lot less maintenance.
Yeah, so we used the published information sources for the numbers do include assumptions on operations and maintenance costs, which you can use. So for some technologies, that's just a fixed cost per installed megawatt. And for some, it's a variable cost where it varies per megawatt hour that you use. But you're dead right that for the solar in particular, it's really, really low. Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, if you're comparing back to the original gas option, that is the fuel is the major component of the operating cost. Any other questions?
What sort of capacity factors did you apply for the solar?
So that was site specific. I used a couple of different kinds of modelling software, which then fed into a big spreadsheet model. For the electrical components, I don't know if you operate in the field or not, but I use Homer Pro, which is the simple Homer Pro model, which uses specific weather data. It's a global database. It uses specific data for the location that you're at. And the capacity factor for the solar was really good, because this is somewhere in the middle of the Northern Territory. And for the wind, actually from the Homer Pro database, didn't look too bad. And it broadly matched some initial data that we have on the wind resource from a SODAR, which is on site. So one of the steps forward that the company has taken in the last 6 months is to install a wind measuring device on site, a SODAR, and we're waiting until we get a year of data from that, which will then feed into an electrical renewable study to jump slightly to the end. Electric heat thermal storage. This is my favourite, and I was really disappointed it didn't win, but it didn't, because you get that high capacity factor of the combined wind and solar, and then you're turning it into heat. But it was it was actually the cost per thermal megawatt of the winning ones which outcompeted this. So the final two are the two pathways which are based broadly around concentrated solar thermal. And we picked one over the other, but actually they were both matter of muchness. So thermal energy for electricity is where you've got one big CST plant and then you're using that to generate the electricity which you need. And then separate electrical thermal generation is broadly the same concept, but you're complementing it with PV, wind and battery as well. So it's really more of a hybrid solution around the electrical. And that one came out as the winner. It was the dark blue and the yellow were basically the same in terms of their overall economics, but the solar and wind and battery installation for the separate electrical renewables just makes sense to do as a no regret action to get you started. And in the early years of the project, when capital is potentially more constrained, that makes a big difference as well. So the pathway which we eventually published, and you can go on the internet and read, talks about starting with electrical renewables to take the electricity to about 50% renewable energy fraction by 2030. And then the introduction of a demonstration scale concentrated solar plant before 2030 as well, and then the progressive scaling up of those two technologies. So it's essentially pathway one, which means it was the first pathway that we thought of. But I wouldn't have felt confident recommending that if we hadn't done all this work to look at all the other options. And it gives us a lot of comfort to know that we've gone through all of this work to understand how do all these different options stack up. Unless someone suggests a number 6 now, which I haven't thought of.
Just before you ask that question, I might just pass the mic around so that we get the questions onto the video.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
So
I was
I'm gonna
about 2
come to you
slides
in
off
a
the
minute
official
as soon as
questions.
I work out the levels here. Yes. Technology. Don't you love it?
So just for me to catch up a little bit, the scenario which you were sort of instinctively attracted to, but then turned out to be middle of the range there, the thermal storage one. What was the advantage of the thermal storage? What was the need for thermal storage rather than directly going to generation?
So the end requirement is power 24/7. And at the beginning of the chain, whatever your form of renewables is, whether or not it's concentrated solar thermal, wind or PV, you've got variability. So in order to get to 24/7 provision against the load, you need some form of storage. And that storage can be battery, which is the electrify everything pathway, or it can be thermal of some form. The reason that I was biased towards it and attracted to it is if you're comparing two different forms of thermal energy storage and what they're connected to, and the first one is concentrated solar thermal, which is then connected to a big reservoir of molten salt. Well, that's only actually receiving sunlight and getting hot for 8 hours a day. Whereas if you've got these hot bricks and you're putting energy in, heating them from electrical energy, which is actually remarkably efficient, like 90% efficient, then not only have you got the sunshine during the day, but you've got the wind overnight as well. So it's still variable, but to the capacity factor point, your combined capacity factor, the combined amount of time that you're generating renewable energy is higher.
Yeah.
And because you don't need to get the power out the other side as electricity, you just need it out as heat, it's pretty efficient getting it out as heat as well. So it's only, again, it's at 90% or so efficient.
So what I was thinking,
What I was thinking, or following one, is why wouldn't you just store that thermal energy in your swimming pools of hot water rather than take that interim step of putting in bricks?
So why wouldn't you store it in the water? It's a good question. I don't know anything about the... what I was thinking about there was about the, what's the right word? It's like the specific heat of molten salt compared to water. So
I wouldn't know, but I do know that water is slightly different.
yeah, so molten salt is just one example of a story. That's true. I think you don't lose a lot of energy through the heat exchange process, and probably the like the volume of storage that you would need, and then the cost of the storage vessel and everything.
That volume of storage of water would be huge.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
The amount of heat that you can
the ambient heat leak from that volume of storage of water would be huge.
Okay, so it would cool down pretty quick as well. Yeah, yeah. It sounds like we've already got the opportunity for the discussion afterwards.
I think the thing is the temperature. You actually need a temperature that you can generate steam with, yeah. So if you store,
Yep.
if you store it as water, then you
Yeah, that's true.
So you've got to have something that's hotter than that. And,
Yeah.
And the hotter it is, as it cools down, you've still got a margin that allows you to then continue to generate steam as the storage depletes, because the storage is going to cool down as it depletes. So you've got to start really hot. So
And then
at
cool
the
it.
end of the day, when it's fully depleted, it's still hot enough to generate 200 degrees C steam.
Yep, great point.
So salt becomes an optimal medium.
Salt is the preferred medium from a lot of concentrated solar thermal plants at the moment. Having said that, our plant, which might be on the next slide, this plant.
That's the modular one.
This is the Port Augusta one, which has just received, or there will be one in Port Augusta with Vast Solar. There was an announcement about it earlier in the week. That doesn't use molten salt. It uses some kind of new fluid, which I can't remember now, because molten salt has some disadvantages. So it's very good from a specific heat point of view, but there's problems. You have to keep it warm. It's very important that you keep it warm. So you've got to do resistance heating of the salt to not let it get too cool. And there are corrosion issues and so on with it as well. So there are different options, but I think there's also a whole range of, some materials are really good at this and some materials are definitely not good at it. It was interesting that you're thinking on the water there and the need for the temperature differential, because you're absolutely right. And it brings us back to the reality from the spreadsheet. So all this work was like getting really, really deep into the spreadsheet, but trying to keep a link back to, well, the decisions you make at the end of the day end up with things which look like this in a field. And this is only a 1.1 megawatt concentrated solar plant. That's the one which is, where is their current one? That's a good question.
It's in New South Wales or something.
Yeah. And that's then the bigger one in Port Augusta, which is going to be grid connected for the generation of electricity primarily. And I think that's quite interesting in its own right, actually, because if you go back 5 years when it was abundantly obvious that the costs had come down for PV and wind, no one really wanted to build concentrated solar thermal plants because you could sell your power into the electricity grid, and it was so cheap to produce you could make lots of money from it. But what's happening now is that we're getting to this next stage of the transition where actually having dispatchable energy, which you can dispatch at different times of the day, is becoming much more valuable in the electricity market, because that's what the system needs. And so things like concentrated solar thermal are starting to come back into the fore. So I think that there's bound to be a resurgence of those sorts of things. Yes.
Just one question, circling back to those different methods.
Yeah.
Have you looked at the difference in cost if we completely ignore this silly climate change thing and just the climate change notion, and just look at a basic business case between building a nice gas-fired turbine out in the middle of the desert and just running this thing fully on fossil fuels? Have you looked at a cost difference between the thermal energy, the final one you chose, and doing it the good old-fashioned way?
Yeah, so, I mean, these graphs are presented as equivalent gas price, but the shape of the graph is roughly the same if you just think about it in pure money terms. So basically what it's showing you is, yes, there are some pathways, particularly when you're introducing electrical renewables like wind and solar in the early stages, which are definitely cheaper than the cost of operating on gas. But what you find is there is this hockey stick effect. So if your goal is to operate your plant at a certain load 100% of the time, you have to introduce more and more and more renewables and battery storage to get there. So you wouldn't, on a pure business case, go to 100% renewables right now, until you've identified ways to really deal with that challenge. But one thing you do get from renewables is you don't get the exposure to the variability in the price of the fossil fuels. So this is based on a flatline assumption on what that price is.
What about sticking with the gas and capturing the carbon and storing it?
Yeah, that's a good question. We didn't.
Sticking with gas, but then capturing the CO2 from the facility and storing it underground.
Have we got any proven technology that can do that? Yes.
So we didn't consider from the location of the site where it was that carbon capture would be practical. So we didn't include it in one of the pathways. I think to your point, Vanessa, Larissa, on feasibility, that needs to be factored in, but it probably wouldn't be a reason to write it off in its own right at the moment.
You need somewhere to stick it as relatively close by.
Yeah,
That's the
yeah.
problem. Otherwise, you've got to build a very big pipeline to somewhere.
Yeah. So we are by a gas pipeline, but that brings the gas to the plant, not CO2 away.
I think with the sustainability aura that we're trying to achieve, I would be hesitant to go straight towards
Go down that path.
Yeah, blue hydrogen or whatever, or yeah, sequestration.
Michael,
Yep.
what's the starting point for the emissions? And I think in one graph, Max, you probably got a 25% reduction by 2030.
Yep. Yep.
So that's not aligned to
To
our
SBTI. Yep.
NDC.
Yep.
Will you emit so much that you come under the safeguard mechanism, or?
Do you want me to answer that, Michael?
I don't know if we're talking about that yet.
Yeah.
We will be talking about it very soon.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I would say, thank you for stopping me answering that question.
I would love to as well.
The company man in the corner. Obviously, I would love it if this plant, to Keith's point, was running on renewables on day one.
Yeah.
I think the reality is that rare earths extraction is a very inherently energy intensive process. Rare earths aren't rare, but they do require a lot of energy to get them out of the rock. And the world needs them for the transition.
Yep.
So we should be trying to get to the point where we are doing that renewably without emissions as quickly as possible. It's wrapped in the business case of the project. And one of the main things for the project is that the startup is in 2025. And a lot of this, Mike called it a chemistry step, a lot of this is new technology and relatively unproven. So to then throw into the mix a high level of renewable power generation at the same time makes the $1 billion capex, which you mentioned earlier, a bigger number, so it's harder to get investors for. And it also, in the eyes of the project, introduced additional risk as well into the commissioning process. So I think
Don't think investors will be looking for a 2030.
they, so
A defendable 2030 point in the business case.
some investors will.
I'm not sure
Yeah.
we've come across that yet, though.
The pressure has been more customer.
Yeah.
It's been the customers are very, very keen to see that their upstream scope 3 is reduced as quickly as possible. There aren't necessarily easy answers to getting there as quickly as you can, in which you can make the case.
What's your ideal customer?
So we are a bit different in how we're operating, as we are directly marketing OEMs, original equipment manufacturers, car companies, wind turbine manufacturers, the big ones in Europe, of offering them a solution from our mind, or to oxide, through to metallization and magnetization and into their equipment. So we've got folks along the way that we are guaranteeing contracts with. So we are not selling to the defense industry, we're not selling to mobile phones, we're selling to the energy transition. So I think we would have to think, with that messaging, I think we would have to think carefully about, are we putting carbon dioxide back into the ground for something that may or may not work, something that's still being figured out. You know, I'd certainly like to see us stay, we will have to use gas initially and for a while as that decreases. I'd certainly like to see that personally not be fracked to gas from Beetaloo. I think that kind of detracts from our story, what we're trying to tell. But there are a lot of people in those decisions, of course.
Jerome.
Yeah, great presentation. I like this graph. If I was a pure businessman and I was investing in energy for this site, I'd choose the grey line.
Okay. Can you explain?
It's the cheapest across the whole time.
The gas line, you mean?
Yeah. Is that the
Although
gas?
there isn't.
Is that the gas-fired power station?
That is an assumption on an assumed gas price. So you're buying all that gas and using it at a gas-fired power station.
Yeah. So with that statement, my question is this. How does fluctuations in some of the key prices in this model affect the optimum answer? And what did you find was sort of the major uncertainties that drove the decision?
Yeah, so we did do some sensitivity modelling where we put some ranges on some key inputs. It didn't change the overall answer. It showed some pathways had a broader range, particularly in the longer term, because there was a higher level of variability in the potential cost of certain technologies. We also, part of that was also looking at potential variations in the gas price, and also in the price of ACCUs, so offsets, because that affected the cost of the baseline which we were comparing against as well.
And that's kind of preempted my next question, which is with what level of certainty? What's the confidence interval?
Yeah, so I would direct you back to the ranges in the back of the report, which were done based on, so we essentially the ranges are, I did a Monte Carlo analysis, I'm sure you know what Monte Carlo analysis is, with 5% and 95%. So the ranges are presentations of the 5 to 95%. So they changed over time, yeah. So it wasn't sophisticated in the sense that it was mostly just a linear, like a linear high and a linear low from now out to 2050.
Just another comment, Jerome. So yes, the gray line is probably the cheapest, but like we're going through funding with EFA and NAIF, and with Kia, who's our one in South Korea, who we've announced off-takes with, and the other off-takers who will be announced shortly. And they would not be doing business with us if we didn't have a net zero 2050 plan.
And the other point is the price of carbon is not going to be zero for very long.
Yeah.
As soon as you start putting carbon prices onto that, the grey line is going to look pretty, or the black line is going to look pretty dire. By the time you get out to 2045, that is not going to be the equivalent of $8 a gigajoule when you stick a carbon price on it.
Yeah. So, yeah.
What's the current price you get? $65 gigajoules.
Well, there's the East Coast cap to 12. Yeah. It got up to 25 or so. So.
It's 750 here, I think.
Yeah, I mean this is this is in the NT, not WA, so it's not subject to the gas reservation. But it is, and there is potential the line that the site is on will be able to export to the East Coast in the future, so it could well be higher. We were very keen to make this analysis based on the same starting point as all the other analysis which is out there around the project, and the project update, which included an $8.34 pricing assumption for gas, was only published a few months before this, so we decided it was good to be consistent with that.
Where's that gas line going to?
It's the Amadeus pipeline. So the site sits on the Amadeus pipeline, basically. Yeah.
It'd be very easy to just stay on gas.
Alex. Oh, sorry, Dory. Sorry.
I'm just very
here is that particular interested to know the dollar per ton of emission reduction that you are looking into all this scenario, especially number 4 and number 1. So what's the
So like a marginal abatement cost curve, right? So how much are you paying for your emissions reduction? I can't give you a direct answer other than to say it's negative where it's below the line and it's positive above the line, because the blue is saying compared to the business as usual at the beginning when you introduce those initial renewables, it's actually saving you money, so it's a negative abatement cost. And then it stacks up after that. I just don't have the figures to hand.
like in all those your planning scenario from 2025 to 2050, the prices would be changing, or you would have the average?
No, we projected prices. So we had things like continuing falling in the costs of PV, for example. Whereas more mature technologies stayed pretty static.
And about $40 a tonne
for
across the board is what you're paying on average, because it's $2 a gigajoule on average difference to the gas price.
Yep.
And a gigajoule of gas is 50 kilograms of CO2, which is a 20
okay.
tonne. So
yeah.
$2 times 20 is $40 a tonne.
Yeah. Which is important when we think about where the offset price might be in the future, because the other competing
offset price.
Yeah, exactly.
The safeguard mechanism goes through. The floor price will be $75.
The maximum price will be $75.
Floor price. Who's going to sell you an offset for less than $75 if the government will sell it to you for $75?
I need to think about that one, because I always thought about it as a ceiling.
Isn't the price of carbon in Europe currently around $100?
Yeah,
It's gone over 100 euros. Yeah.
Well,
100 euros.
Yeah.
Well, and in fact, that's another good reason why the project needs to think about this, because, exactly, the border adjustment.
Yeah.
So essentially a tax they might have to pay if they've got a high carbon content. I'm conscious of the time. Alex, would you like to ask one?
A few questions together, because a lot of the questions that have been asked have been things that influence sort of cost risk and execution risk a lot.
Yeah.
And you mentioned at the end of the report there's a load of ranges you've done. And
Yeah.
things. But when you just look at that, has anything been done to compare apples with apples in terms of what's presented there? Is there some sort of cost risk factored into there for complexity and maturity of technologies and all that kind of thing?
Not, because those are the 50th percentile lines, basically.
50s, yeah.
So not in that presentation.
Because if you just saw that, you might jump at number 1 for argument's sake, but actually if that's got the biggest cost risk and it's kind of
it's always going to be imperfect, and it was a bit of a risk deciding to put this out into the world as well. But we felt it was important to show that we were systematically approaching as best we could with the information available how to tackle this challenge.
presumably diving into that stuff you talked about at the end that no one ever gets to would give us a bit more understanding of
yes, it would.
what the more
But no one ever gets to it.
I guess,
Yeah. So the release itself, if you want to go and download it, it's on the Arafura website, and it's got the bit at the front which the investors read, and then it's got the main report which the engineers read, and then it's got the appendix which no one reads. So just to finish off, everything we've talked about so far is about stationary power, and there is 10% of the mine's emissions which are associated with mobile plant, and actually also with chemical processes so the emissions from the plant itself as well. At future stages, we need to tackle that stuff as well. So there's only one more slide that I was going to show, but just before I got onto that, I just wanted to highlight that, in case you can't tell, I found this an incredibly exciting and interesting job to work on, with lots of challenges about how to think my way through it. And what I liked about it is that it's kind of a microcosm of the challenges of the energy system in general. So it was quite a privilege to be able to work on that, and it threw up all sorts of thorny and challenging questions, some of which you've highlighted. It's not as easy as you might want it to just turn a switch.
That's where the scenario planning is so powerful.
Yeah.
And the trade-offs that we're going to have to make.
Yeah. Energy security, the version of energy security in that. So.
And for anyone who hasn't got the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, TNFD, so I would really encourage you all, if you're starting a project, know what your IBRA biome is, or your sub-region, and start skilling yourself up about the natural capital that your project's in, because it's coming like a tsunami at all of us.
Yeah.
And you know, for future greenfields projects, we're going to have to factor that in.
As much as the, yeah, exactly, as much as the climate disclosures, yeah. So the final slide is just to say thanks to this organisation. So I actually don't think there's anyone here from the Minerals Research Institute of WA today, but Erin, who was the lead author for this report, was going to come along but couldn't make it. This was the Bible, basically, when we were working through this piece of work. They published this in, I think it was late 2021, might have been early 2022, as a series of 3 reports, which are very accessible, easy to read, and are basically a how-to guide to do all of this stuff. So that was the framework from which we started. And when I met them to talk to them about it and just basically say thank you, they said this is exactly the scenario that they were putting this report out for. So they know that the really big guys will probably have whole teams of people who are doing all of this stuff and their own structured processes. But it's the juniors, it's the people in the middle who need this kind of guidance and support. So those documents are well worth a look. So thank you very much.
Cool,
happy to share. And we can go back to another question in a minute. Michael, come on up. So I'm conscious of the time. Any other burning questions? We did want to do a quick activity just to round things off.
Just one quick one. You mentioned that guy holding the black stuff dropping out. What was that technology?
Yeah, so it's rather than running a liquid past your solar receiver, you take these particles, just sort of big grains of sand, basically.
They're from the fracking industry.
Right. Yes, that's true. And then you lift them up to the top, and then you drop them, and they get hot as they go past the receiver where the sun is shining, very, very hot. And then you can take...
It's really unintuitive.
It's just a flowing solid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and they flow fast as well, don't they?
And unlike salt, when it gets cold, it doesn't freeze. That's its big advantage.
Yeah, and it's in the open air.
So you've got to just have more...
when it flows past, the receiver, it's in the open air when it flows past the receiver, and then it goes into basically a big bucket of these things. And then it heat exchanges. Yeah, so it's a CSIRO developed technology, which they are looking to commercialise at the moment. And they already have decent sized demonstration plants, actually. Yeah. Jerome, did you have one question? You sure? Yeah. All right, sounds good. Any other questions for Michael before we wrap up on the Q&A?
Thanks for sharing. It's amazing peer-based learning. It's fantastic.
Thanks, Larissa.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Thank you.